you may not come to that insight. It's mindful of the body, releasing some tension. Good.
And last question, earlier today you mentioned sugar as one of the things that we should avoid because it can interrupt with our meditation, and I was wondering if you have any more do's or don'ts regarding dietary, anything that...
Yeah. Well, I think that, I mean, I'm no dietitian or anything, but I mean, I think just a healthy diet is important, and certainly, less processed foods I think is good, and also my personal opinion is like a plant-based diet would be very good for the plant-based, no animal products. For ethical reasons, for saving the environment reasons, but also I think more and more it's showing a lot of health benefits, actually doing like plant-based protein and so forth over meat-based protein. So I think there's a number of reasons for that, but I think in general, just to sort of have a healthy diet, and really avoid a lot of processed foods. I think generally processed foods are not very good.
Coffee, that's
Coffee.
For me, it's the best.
The best. Sometimes people ask me about coffee. Certainly if you are really going into some sort of retreat, and myself, I like a bit of coffee, and I drink a cup or so or two every day. That's fine. But certainly when I go into retreat, I really cut it out, because you'll find that in retreat, and I tested this once, I was in a retreat for a while, and then I had a cup of coffee, and it was like, whoa, it was like just so agitating, so imbalanced. Whereas in a normal daily life, it just sort of, picks you up a little bit. But certainly I wouldn't recommend any sort of stimulant when you're doing a longer retreat. But in a daily life, I think if you, again, in the morning, if you're a little bit sluggish and you want to meditate and you have a little bit of coffee to perk you up, I think that's fine. Of course, 3 or 4 cups before meditating is probably not a good idea. You're just going to get very agitated. So a little bit of caffeine, I think, to stimulate a bit in the morning. If you're a bit sluggish, I think that's okay.
I have 2 questions about the coffee. I'm going to dullness all the time.
Yeah.
So today, before now, I decided to drink coffee.
Mm-hmm.
I'm used to drink coffee, but here I drink less,
Mm-hmm.
and I was sharp. I was very awake. So it's like, help me.
Yeah, right. But of course, it's okay. But if we have to always rely on a stimulant to be alert, then
Yes.
we're dependent on something. So ideally, we want to be able to develop this without having to take stimulants. So we need to be careful we don't get too dependent on that every time I need to be alert in meditation, I have to have a coffee. I think we want to try and let go of that dependency on coffee to be alert in meditation.
And the second one is when I'm doing the whole body breathing, so it's my focus was on the sensation on all the body,
Mm-hmm.
not only the space that I'm breathing, the
Mm-hmm.
area that I'm
Mm-hmm.
breathing, like my scalp and everything,
Mm-hmm.
as an object.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, generally with this breath practice, it's not sensations anywhere in the body in general, but it's any sensations associated with the act of breathing. I mean, you may, if you're very mindful and you're breathing, you may notice because of that some sensations moving down the legs and so forth. But in general, we're trying to notice any sensations in the body that somehow is connected with the breathing. That's sort of the focus in this.
When you were talking about mindfulness and the sentence around not judging, sort of having a non-judging mind, and you said that it might be better to look at it in terms of evaluating.
Mm-hmm.
Can you clarify when you would do that evaluating? Because that for me feels like it would be a way to keep entering into the thoughts. If you start to enter into an evaluation.
Right. In terms of, so the question is about doing evaluation in mindfulness practice. And that's really introspection. That's the quality control. That's doing the evaluating. It's monitoring the body and mind. And for that introspection, we need to do that in a very, what's the word I'm looking for? In a very subtle way, not in a forceful way, and not too often. Because that evaluation is a little interruption in our mindfulness, actually. But for us as beginners, we need that quite often, because very quickly we usually end up in some dullness or distraction. So if we don't do that little bit of monitoring, then we're gone for longer periods. So as a beginner, we need to do that more often, but then as we get deeper in the practice, to do it less often.
I understood it in the context of, you were explaining it in the context of anger.
Oh yeah, this is, yeah.
And so doing mindfulness...
That's evaluating others and our own behaviour.
Yes. And so that, I think, when would you do... So if you're trying to do mindfulness to handle anger, for example, or to
Right.
handle a heavy emotion of whatever kind,
Right.
rather than not being non-judgmental, which
Right.
wouldn't necessarily give you a sense of what's good or
Right.
bad behavior, when would be the right time to do that? I guess. Is that part of the meditation, or is that interesting?
No, well, that was more talking about like in daily life when anger arises, or when we see someone behaving badly, not to judge them, but to evaluate their behaviour. So that's a thing we need to be constantly doing in daily life in terms of our own and others' behaviour, is to evaluate rather than judge.
I want to ask, you mentioned the term mindfulness practice. So I was wondering, because I talked to you about it earlier today, I try to do it like if I'm washing dishes or I'm doing something repetitive, and I'm wondering how does it fit with like Shamatha attempt to get more handle on Shamatha meditation? Are
Right.
the two practices even related? Or?
Right. So the question is, like, if we're doing some mindfulness practice in daily life, like being mindful with dishes and so forth, how does that relate to Shamatha practice? That's something I'm going to talk about towards the end of the retreat in more detail, but a brief answer now is that as I mentioned, every practice has two parts: meditation and integrating into daily life. So here in Shamatha, meditation is that we are cultivating mindfulness, that in meditation we are strengthening mindfulness by focusing on a single object. So that's strengthening mindfulness in a very efficient, effective way. Then what we need to do is to continue to work on that throughout the day to support that. So then outside of meditation, we are to continue to work with mindfulness. Of course, if we're sitting quietly in meditation focusing on a single object, then that's a much more effective way of really strengthening mindfulness. But of course, we need to keep working on mindfulness in daily life. And the way we do that is simply by being fully present with whatever we're doing in daily life. And that's going to help continue to work and strengthen that mindfulness, which will then feed back into the Shamatha practice, which means that we can go deeper into the Shamatha practice, which means we can bring that mindfulness into daily life, we can be more present with everything we do, and they'll work together. Whereas often what people unfortunately do is, maybe they're quite dedicated in doing their practice every morning and then 30 minutes of focusing on the breath or whatever, but then they jump up and run around like crazy for the rest of the day, mindlessly reacting to things. So then they wonder why their practice is not really going anywhere. It's because, 30 minutes of increasing mindfulness versus 14 hours of actively working against mindfulness, which one of those is going to win out? But if we keep working on mindfulness for those 14 hours that we're awake, then instead of eroding the mindfulness that we've developed in meditation, it will continue to build it. And so they'll work together. Okay, let's go for this evening's topic. So we saw yesterday evening that, that the Buddha taught these what's called the 3 turnings of the wheel, that in the initial teachings he taught these 4 noble truths, and then he taught also what's called the perfection of wisdom teachings, where he went a bit deeper and taught this idea of emptiness, and then that 3rd turning of the wheel as well. And from that we had Buddhist teachings spreading from India through the Pali and Sanskrit languages, and through the Pali language it was really very much based on the 4 noble truths, and this is really the foundation of all Buddhist traditions. So that's what I'd like to talk about this evening. And to talk about 4 noble truths, and the 4 noble truths was the very first teaching the Buddha gave after he achieved enlightenment. Often when a topic is presented in Buddhism, to help understand that concept or topic, often we find that analogies are used, a simple analogy, to help us to understand something a little bit more profound or deeper. And so here in presenting 4 noble truths, often the analogy that is used is the analogy of a physical illness. So if we think we have some sort of physical illness, then generally we go to the doctor, because we believe the doctor is qualified to help us. And when we go to the doctor, what is the first thing that generally the doctor does? Diagnosis. And diagnosis usually has 2 parts, or 2 steps, 2 stages. The first is part of the diagnosis. The doctor would examine us to see what condition are we in. Maybe doing some blood tests, or maybe checking the pulse and doing various tests, just to see what condition we're in. And then based on that, then the doctor would go on to try to determine what is the underlying illness that is presenting itself in this way. And the analogy that we're using here is the analogy of a curable illness. So what comes after diagnosis?
Treatment.
Prognosis. And the prognosis here, of course, is that we can be cured. And of course, what comes after the prognosis is the cure or the remedy. Similarly, the Buddha is being like our doctor. So this is the 4 noble truths now. So in the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha is being like our doctor. He's diagnosing what condition do we find ourselves in now. And the first Noble Truth is what condition we find ourselves, what is the human condition, is suffering. But remember, here this word suffering is a translation of the word dukkha, which we saw earlier today. So the human condition of suffering doesn't mean we're always in some sort of unpleasant, painful experience. So this human condition is that we are stuck in this state of dukkha, meaning sometimes we have pleasant experiences, sometimes we have unpleasant experiences, but underlying both of those, we have this all-pervasive dukkha. There's always a potential for suffering to arise in our life. This is the human condition of dukkha. Why are we stuck in this state of dukkha? What is the underlying illness, the cause? So the second noble truth is the cause or origin of suffering or dukkha. In Sanskrit, this is samudaya. And what is identified here as the underlying cause or origin, remember we saw earlier, is the mental afflictions. In particular here, the fundamental ignorance, this distorted view of reality. But then we said that these mental afflictions are driving our behaviour, and every action we do based on a mental affliction has a result. The result is dukkha. So the second component here is then our actions. Because it's the mental afflictions that are driving our actions, our behaviour, and those actions are giving us the result of dukkha or suffering. So in the second noble truth, these two elements are identified. And of course, the underlying cause is our distorted view of reality. And then the prognosis, the Buddha's prognosis is that we can be cured of this condition of dukkha. And so the third noble truth is the truth of cessation. In Sanskrit, nirod. Cessation here means the ceasing or ending of all suffering and its causes. So the third noble truth is that we can achieve liberation from all suffering and its causes, the cessation of all suffering and its causes. How do we achieve this healthy state, this ending of all suffering and its causes? What is the cure? Is the fourth noble truth, the truth of the path leading to the cessation of suffering. In Sanskrit, marg. So to have a look at these Four Noble Truths in a little bit more detail, we can go to the chart in the middle of your booklet, the three vehicles. Oh, before we do that, just a couple of points here. So when the Buddha presented these Four Noble Truths, he said that suffering is to be known, because if we don't know the condition we're in, it's a little bit like if we don't know that we're sick, we're never going to take any steps to try and cure ourselves. We'll just think this is normal and we'll stay in that condition. Similarly, if we don't know we're in this state of dukkha, we're not going to even contemplate the idea, well, can I overcome this? So suffering is to be known. The cause or origin of suffering is to be eliminated. The cessation of suffering and its causes is to be no, it's not to, is to be to be attained. And the path is to be cultivated. Now, sometimes when people hear this teaching on the Four Noble Truths, in particular, when they see the first presentation, the truth of suffering or dukkha, particularly on the basis of translating dukkha as suffering, and then often quite a detailed presentation is given there, then sometimes people go, wow, Buddhism's so pessimistic. Actually, that's impossible. Because a diagnosis can't be pessimistic. A diagnosis is either accurate or inaccurate. Prognosis could be pessimistic, but in terms of diagnosis, you can't say that's pessimistic. It doesn't make sense. It's either accurate or inaccurate. So our job is to check that and see whether that's accurate or not, what the Buddha was saying. Is dukkha, this idea of dukkha, is that really the condition we find ourselves in? And if we don't know that, then it's a little bit like we're sick and we don't know we're sick. We're just going to get stuck there. We're not going to even think about the possibility of curing ourselves because we won't realise we're in this condition.
That's what I asked about, people that don't know that they're suffering and do harmful things without knowing. Sorry for interfering.
Yeah. But, I mean, that doesn't mean they don't suffer.
Yeah, they just don't know that they... Sometimes I can see it. Like, I think I can see it.
Sure. That's true.
People that don't know they suffer.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's why we're saying suffering is bliss.
Really?
Well, I love about bliss.
No, it's not bliss, it's ignorance.
Ignorance is bliss.
It's like,
It's some sort of blessing.
Blessing. Oh, ignorance is a blessing?
no, it's suffering.
Oh, suffering is a blessing.
Otherwise, we wouldn't be aware.
Sure. And that is actually true, is when we won't go into it here now, but sometimes there's a presentation about the qualities of suffering. And one of the qualities of suffering is exactly this, is that it often helps us to realise there's something not quite right here. Let's, and actually in reality, for many people, it's only after some quite strong suffering that they think about their life and they go, oh, hang on, what's going on here? And so very often, suffering is a catalyst for people doing this, to look for something more meaningful in life. And it's often the catalyst to enter in some sort of more meaningful spiritual life is suffering. That doesn't mean we need to dwell in suffering for that to happen, but for many people it actually is the catalyst. And what often happens is if we don't have that, we're sort of just, it's a bit like we're sort of sick but we don't really realise it, and nothing changes, and we just sort of float along like that for our whole life, and that's often what happens. And it's often that when we're faced with some really difficult, challenging experience, that pushes us to think about life. And so then that can be very helpful. So that's one of the qualities of suffering, is that it can really be a catalyst for change in our life.
So if you get rid of suffering, what are the catalysts of change?
Well, you only get rid of suffering after you've changed. Suffering doesn't magically disappear.
You don't ever have to change after you've got, when you're enlightened, you never really need to have transformation or change.
No, because you're already transformed. You've already got rid of all suffering and its causes. Okay. So let's have a look here at this 3 vehicles chart. So remember here, the Four Noble Truths is the foundation of all Buddhist traditions. And in particular, it's really the core of the path within the Theravada tradition. So this healthy state, this cessation of suffering, is often referred to as nirvana. And we'll talk a little bit more about nirvana tomorrow evening. So we can see here that the goal of the spiritual path is this state of nirvana. So the goal is to achieve this healthy state, this cessation of all suffering and its causes. And when we achieve that healthy state, we become known what's called as an arhat. That's a Sanskrit word. So an arhat is someone who has eliminated all suffering and its causes and has achieved this goal of nirvana. Now, to strive for that goal of nirvana, then we need to develop an aspiration for that. To develop the aspiration for nirvana, of course, we need to reflect on the first 2 Noble Truths, to understand the condition we find ourselves in and understand where that's coming from, the mental afflictions, and understand that these mental afflictions are something we can eliminate. And when we understand that we can achieve this healthy state, then we'll develop an aspiration for that. And that is renunciation. But here, as I mentioned, I think earlier, this word renunciation, or this is not a very good translation. It can be very misleading. The original Sanskrit term here is nisarana. This nisarana we can divide into 2. The ni prefix means out of, away from, and sarana means to move. So nisarana means to move out of, to move away from. So it's really the aspiration to move out of, away from suffering, to liberation. So this term in Sanskrit is really the aspiration to be liberated from suffering. Whereas the word renunciation really doesn't have that sort of exact meaning. But someone some years ago decided to translate it as renunciation, and it sort of stuck. So you'll find the word renunciation used quite a lot. But whenever you see the word renunciation here, it really means the aspiration for liberation, the aspiration to be liberated from suffering. And then once we've cultivated that aspiration, then we have to implement the cure. So the cure, of course, is the path leading to the cessation of suffering. And so that is here, these practices. So here in the Theravada tradition, when the path is presented, usually the most common presentation you'll see here is this presentation of the Noble Eightfold Path. So these are 8 practices that we engage in to achieve liberation from suffering. And so here we see them listed as right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration, right view, and right thought. These 8 practices can be condensed into these 3 main core areas of practice that we've mentioned a few times. The 3 main areas of practice of ethics, concentration, wisdom. So here we can see that right speech, right action, and right livelihood can be condensed into as ethics, And then right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration is condensed as concentration. And then right view and right thought